My name is Lindsay Wilkes, and I'm the owner of the Cottage Mama and author of the book, So Classic Clothes for Girls. Thank you so much for joining me today on Lessons with Lindsay. Today we are talking about all things ruffles and gathering. If you sew for children, especially little girls, ruffles and gathers are inevitable, but they can be a little bit confusing, and there's so many different ways to gather fabric. So today I'm going to go over a few different ways for you to gather that might make your life a little bit easier when sewing for children. So I have a dress here that I just kind of wanted to show you some gathering that's been done here. We have this ruffle down at the bottom. That's a pretty tight gather here. And then the skirt's also been gathered and attached to a dress bodice. Now, many of my patterns have gathering in them. I have a few A-line patterns which don't require any gathering, but the majority of my dresses do have some gathering. And a gathered skirt dress on a little girl is so much fun because she can just twirl and twirl and twirl, and little girls love to twirl. So I'm going to show you a few different feet and techniques for gathering. So first, I've got a gathering foot here. Now this might look a little bit intimidating. It's got all kinds of metal on it and doesn't even really look like a sewing machine foot, does it? But it's really wonderful if you want to gather a lot of fabric and you want perfect gathering every time. There's different aspects of this foot that I'd like to show you. Up here we have some markings. We've got a star, we've got a 12, a 6, and a 1. Now, what does that mean? Well, the 1, where I have it set right now, means for every stitch, you're going to have a gather. The 6, for every 6 stitches, you're going to have a gather. For every 12 stitches, you're going to have a gather. And the star means you're going to have no gathering at all. So you can adjust this. You just move it over. Now, for gathering children's clothing, especially little girls' garments, you're most likely going to have it set at the 1 because we're going to use a full gather. But if you were doing something more like a pleat, or maybe you were doing an adult garment or something for home dec, you might use those 6 and 12 a little bit more. Now, we've got another aspect of the foot. So there's this thing that kind of looks like a screw here, and there's different numbers here. Now that is going to depend on how deep the gather is. So if you want a really deep gather, that's going to pull the fabric in more and it's going to give you a fuller look to the skirt. If you'd prefer a smaller gather, then you're not going to have as much fullness in the fabric. So this you can adjust. And what you're going to need to do if you get a ruffler is I highly suggest you buy the one that goes with your machine because that's going to work a little bit better for you. But you're just going to need to play around with the settings and figure out exactly what the ratio is to get from gathered fabric to flat fabric when you are attaching the two together using a ruffler. So what this can do is it can just simply gather the fabric for you. And it also can gather and attach the fabric at the same time. So I'll be going over that with you and showing you an example of how this foot works. But if you've never played around with one of these, I think you might really like it. So another option you have for gathering is you can use your serger. Now, I know many of you might not have a serger, but if you're getting into sewing and you're sewing a lot of children's clothing, a serger is a wonderful investment. And a gathering foot for a serger is a great accessory to have. So this tool is fairly simple compared to the ruffler. However, it's going to either gather your fabric just by itself, you can run it through and just gather, or it also will gather and attach and serge the edge at the same time, which can save you a ton of time. I don't know how often you've gathered, but that can be pretty time consuming when you're constructing a garment. So this can make things go pretty quickly. I will say, however, if you're looking for a more full gather, the ruffler is probably going to be a better option for you. I don't feel like the serger gives me quite the volume on a skirt that maybe my ruffler can do for me. So consider that when you're deciding which tool you want to use. Now, maybe you don't have a ruffler and maybe you don't have a serger. So I'm going to show you a traditional way of gathering with just your standard presser foot to get you started. So let's grab some fabric and come over to our sewing machine and just use our standard presser foot to get ruffling. So I'm going to show you how I like to gather when using a piece of fabric that has a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to change the settings on my sewing machine. I'm going to increase the stitch length. I like to go all the way up as high as my machine will go, which is 5. And then I actually increase the tension. This is something that not everybody does, but I take the tension up as high as it will go. Now, something to note, if you are looking for more delicate, petite ruffles, you're not going to want your stitch length all the way up at 5. You may want it more at 3.5 or 4. But I sew with quilting cotton most of the time, and I'm looking for a fuller gather, so I'm going to have my stitch length at 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a strip of fabric that we have here, and since we're sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we are going to run 2 rows of gathering stitches at a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch. Now, something important to note is when you start with a gathering stitch at the beginning of your fabric, you do not want to backstitch. If you backstitch, you will not have the thread or the ability to gather your fabric. So let's put this under the presser foot, and we are going to run our gathering stitch at a 1/4 inch to start. All right, so let's get sewing here. And I find taking the tension up as high as it will go kind of starts that gathering process for us. And another suggestion I have for you is when you're gathering, polyester thread is definitely going to be your friend. It's going to help you gather thicker fabrics, and your thread won't break as easily because it's a bit stronger. Okay, so we're going to just take our presser foot up. We're going to take our needle up. This machine has thread cutting on it, which I absolutely love. However, for gathering, we want some long threads so that we can do our gatherings. So you can see we've already started gathering a bit here. And now I'm going to just take this back and put it back under the presser foot. And we're going to run another row of stitching at a 1/2 inch because that is where my seam allowance is. Now, don't take any shortcuts here with running your 2 rows of gathering stitches. If you only run 1 row of gathering stitches at a 1/4 inch, you're going to end up with something that looks like uneven pleats rather than pretty even gathers. So please don't cut corners. Run your 2 rows of gathering stitches. So here we go again. You want to make sure when you're gathering fabric that you don't backstitch at the beginning or the end of your stitching. If you do that, your threads won't be loose enough to pull to gather, and that's the whole purpose of what we're doing today. All right, so here we're at the end, and again, just take up your needle, take up the presser foot, and we want these nice long threads. Now we have 2 rows of gathering stitches. Another school of thought is some people like to run 1 row of gathering stitches ever so slightly beyond the seam allowance, and they feel like that gives a really nice gather as well. So that's something you could consider. I feel like when I gather in the seam allowance, it provides a beautiful ruffle and gather for me, but you can give that technique a try if you'd like to run one of your rows of stitching beyond your seam allowance. So we have our ruffle here, and we have a piece of fabric. So all you're going to do is you're going to just take your threads and you're going to start to gather. So we've got these 2 long threads here, and I just really pull whichever one will start gathering for me, and I pull them together. So here we go. And what we're doing is we're just going to slide this fabric along these threads until it reaches the same width of our fabric that we have here. Now, a general rule of thumb, if you're creating your own ruffles, is 2.5 times the length of the fabric that you're gathering to is what you're going to want to cut your ruffle to. But if you prefer a not so full gather, then try a 2-to-1 ratio for that. So you're just going to keep sliding these down until everything is nice and even and you've reached the width of this fabric. Let's see how we're doing. We're still a little bit long. Let's just keep on going. Keep on going. Keep on going. All right. So let's check it out. Oh, we still need to do a little bit more. There we go. I think we're almost there. And then you can pull on this other side too if you want to even some things out. And as you can see, you need to take your time with this. Make sure you're nice and even. And that's why this does take a little bit more time, but it's worth it, you know? If you don't take the time to make sure everything's even, it won't look good when it's all sewn together. All right, so we're pretty good there. So then at this point, you would just attach this ruffle to your flat fabric here by putting them right sides together and sewing at your 1/2-inch seam allowance. But if you want to make your life even easier, try the ruffler. So let's do that one next. So here we have our ruffler foot that I was talking to you about earlier. And this is a snap-on foot for my specific machine. Most companies have a ruffler that will be appropriate for your machine. We're going to snap on our ruffler. Now we need to be a little careful here because we've got to get this part here onto the machine. So sometimes I pull up the presser foot a little bit more to make sure I can get this under here. And then I'm going to try to snap it on. Now, as you can see, I sew typically with the needle in the left position. So we're going to need to center our needle to make sure that we can get it in that little tiny hole in there, if you can see that. So I'm going to come over here and get my needle into center position. And let me check that. All right, so see, we are a little bit too far off to the left here. So what I'm going to need to do is adjust the width of my needle. So I'm going to come over here and I am going to increase the width to get it to move to the right. I'm going to check. Now that's close, but I want to move it over even farther. And now let me see where I am. Okay, I'm looking pretty good there. So now we're going to gather a single piece of fabric. So we're going to put it in our foot here. We're going to go over, under, over, and we're just going to kind of slide it in here. And you want to get it as far forward as you can here. And we want to put our presser foot down. And let's just take a few rounds with our hand wheel here, and you're going to see that we want to catch that fabric. Okay, so now we're kind of ready to use our foot pedal here. Let's see, let's get moving. And you see every stitch is gathering because I have it set on 1. And you can control the depth of the gathers with that little screw piece that I showed you earlier. All right, let's cut our thread. And here we have this beautiful gathered piece of fabric that we could just take over and apply to our other fabric here. Now, this is what I'm talking about when I said you need to play with your settings to figure out what ratio you want, whether it's 2-to-1, 2.5-to-1 for your gathered piece of fabric. So here we have this. Now I want to show you how you would go about attaching a gathered piece of fabric to a flat piece of fabric. We're going to keep our settings the same. The difference is we are going to put our piece of fabric that is going to remain flat, non-gathered, on the bottom. We're going to feed it in here and we're going to go under this little guy, and this is going to lay right against the feed dogs there. Now, because we're going to attach these together, we want our fabrics with the right sides together. So we're going to put this one in here, and this takes a little finagling, but to get it in there, it'll be good. So slide it in there and kind of slide it forward so that these get lined up. Let's see, I think we're in there pretty good, maybe. So now we have that loaded. We have the bottom fabric next to the feed dogs, and then we have our fabric to be gathered with the right sides together on top. So let's put the presser foot down and use the hand wheel to get this moving. And again, this takes practice, and you're going to adjust your settings accordingly depending on what you're gathering. So let's just take a few stitches here. You don't need to go too fast. You need to try to keep these lined up as you can. All right, just checking my lower fabric here. Okay, I'm checking again. Okay, let's cut our thread. So as you can see, this gathered and attached it to this fabric. Now, if I were doing this for a garment, I would need to make sure that I had a little bit more length on this ruffle to make sure that it attached perfectly to the flat fabric. So if you're concerned about the length of your ruffle, you may want to just do what we did in the first step, which is gather the fabric first and then attach it. But if you figured out exactly what ratio works well for you with your ruffler, this can just save you so much time. All right, let's move on to our next option for gathering, which is gathering with the gathering serger foot. All right, so now we're going to gather on a serger. So I have my gathering foot for my serger. So I'm just simply going to snap off this foot here. This is the regular standard foot. And we are going to put this one on here. All right, so now we're in place. So in order to gather, we've got to change the settings on our serger. Now, every serger is a little bit different, but for this serger, we have the stitch selector at A. We have the differential feed set at 2. We have the stitch length set at 4. And we have the width set to the widest setting here. So the beautiful thing about gathering on a serger is that it almost does 3 steps in one. So it can gather and attach the fabric to the flat fabric and serge the edge all at one time. But first, I'm just going to show you how you can make a simple, straight, gathered ruffle if you don't want to attach as you go. All right, so we are just going to put this under our presser foot here. Now, it's a little bit different than the ruffler. If you recall, the flat fabric went on the bottom. However, when we're serging and gathering, we want the fabric to be ruffled to be right by the feed dogs, because that's going to help us get our gather. So let's put this in here all the way and kind of get going here. All right. So look at that. Look how pretty that looks. We've got some nice gathers and we've got a serged edge. Now we could just take this and attach it in a traditional way to a flat fabric as well. If you wanted to, check and make sure that it was the right length that you were looking for. But we can also attach it and serge it and gather it at the same time. So let's do that as well. All right, so we're going to grab a ruffle piece of fabric and we are going to place that under here. Okay, then we want to take our flat fabric and we are going to feed that into this little opening here. So what's going to be a little different is that the fabric is going to gather underneath this flat fabric. So there. Now you're going to want to kind of hold these as you go so that they stay nice and lined up because the feed dogs are going to pull the ruffled fabric through. So we don't need to go too fast. Just kind of keep holding that over. Here. Line this up. And let's see. So here you can see we've attached the ruffle to the fabric and we've serged at the same time. Now I don't know if you can tell the difference, but this gather is not quite as tight as the gather that we were doing with our ruffler foot over on the sewing machine. So again, that's just something to consider. You can have a little bit more control over the gather on your ruffler. At least I feel that way. But this is great if you're just looking for a light, pretty gather with your serger. This is a great option. So today you've learned several different techniques for gathering fabric, and I hope that you'll give some of these techniques a try. For more tips and tricks and free patterns, you can check out my website, The Cottage Mama, www.thecottagemama.com. And thank you so much for joining me today on Lessons with Lindsay. And until next time, happy sewing.